As a small business owner, your to-do list is long. The Knot makes advertising easy and connects you with the right couples at the right time. Visit vendors.theknot.com/podcast for 15% off your first month with code podcast15.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 174, a conversation with Bob Drury and Tom Clavin to discuss their latest collaboration, Lucky 666, The Impossible Mission. The year is 1942. The Japanese war machine has rolled up nearly all of the Pacific Theater, and American forces are clinging to what little unconquered territory remains. While U.S. Marines claw their way across Guadalcanal, small contingents of U.S. Army airmen make their way to the lonely, embattled Allied air base on Papua New Guinea. Their mission? To defend Australia from invasion, harass Japanese supply lines, fly perilous bombing missions over enemy-held strongholds, and make reconnaissance runs to provide intelligence for America's nascent island-hopping campaign. The story of Lucky 666 describes in detail one of those missions, which turns out to be the longest dogfight in history. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, Ray, this is Drury, Bob Drury, and thank you for your interest in Lucky 666. It's flattering.
Same here.
Thank you. Okay, so as we jump into this, how about we just get you gentlemen to just set up the main part of your story, and we're going to get into all the details later, but I do want to let the audience know that this book does a very good job of covering the war's point of view from the Southwest Pacific. You really get a sense of what the people in Australia were worried about, MacArthur and all that kind of stuff, but we're going to kind of jump past that for a moment and get to what really probably inspired you to write this story. If you could just give us an idea, just set up the premise of the main story near the end of your book.
Tom, take it away with the overview.
Well, the overview is that the story started because we had gotten my recollection is we had gotten a YouTube video from a person who was a character in one of our previous books, which was an interview with Jay Zeamer about this mission that took place in June of 1943. So that was the beginning of us fleshing out the story by doing more research, and very important to us was that in order to really show what the extreme importance of that June 1943 mission was, we had to detail what was the situation was with the Allies, with the Americans and the British and the Australian forces leading up to June 1943, and why their mission was going to possibly really change the course of the war, at least in the Pacific Theater. So what we started to do is we started with our characters, our main characters who were on that the plane that was called Old 666. But we wanted to do more research. We wanted to find out more about what was going on with the American Navy and MacArthur and Halsey and the Australian command and the Australian situation, which was very dire. I think that a lot of people, even those who are historians, let's say, of 20th century events, might tend to overlook. You look at World War II, and we know it was a victory for the Allies, but might tend to overlook that it was the Allies' cause in the Pacific was hanging by the thinnest of threads in late 1941 and much of 1942, and that was another part of the story that was very fascinating for us.
Ray, I'll tell you a humorous aside. The gentleman Tom is talking about, Dick Benelli, he won the Silver Star on Fox Hill in North Korea in 1951. And I still speak to Dick maybe once a month. He's a young 87-year-old, and he sent us this YouTube, and then he called me up. And, of course, he's a Marine, and so he doesn't have much use for the Army. And at the time, it was the Army Air Corps. Right. And he said, you ought to watch this. This guy reminds me, he should have been a damn Marine, but he was an Army guy. But I still got respect for him, and that's how we stumbled onto the story, more or less. Mm-hmm.
My son is a Marine, and he does not speak well of any of the other branches.
Well, of course, to Marines, the Navy is their transportation, the Army is their backup, and the Air Force is, I'm not sure what the Air Force is.
So as far as the mission at the end, again, without going into too much detail because we want to say that, just give us an idea of what these men are about to get into, and then we'll stop and we'll backtrack a little bit and we'll cover the main characters.
In the bluntest of terms, Ray, it was a suicide mission. But it couldn't be a suicide mission because they had to come back with photos. They weren't even carrying bombs in their B-17 Flying Fortress. We had clawed across Guadalcanal. We had taken the offensive at the Battle of the Coral Sea at Midway. But things were still in doubt, and we needed to get up the Solomon Islands, invade the island of Bougainville, which was the island just south of the Japanese bastion of Rabaul on New Britain. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, Admiral Halsey, whose Marines were going to be in the vanguard of the invasion of Bougainville, needed photographs. He needed to know where the Japanese defenses were, and most important, almost the entire west side of Bougainville is the Empress Augusta Bay, and it's laced with deadly reefs, and he couldn't have his LSTs hung up on these reefs. He needed photographs of where these reefs were, so the Army Corps of Engineers could map out an invasion travelogue, more or less. Right. And they couldn't send a fighter plane. It was a 1,200-mile round trip. A fighter plane wouldn't make it. They certainly weren't going to send a group of bombers. They called for volunteers, and our crew that we write about, the Eager Beavers, they called themselves, they stepped up and accepted this mission.
That's astounding. So hundreds of miles, no fighter protection, no bombers, just this one crew, and they have to get back. They can't be, halfway. One of the anomaly might be the wrong word, but we've read so much, and from the diaries and recollections of the crew we write about, that bomber pilots who were shot down on their way back from a bombing mission at least had the knowledge, I dropped my bombs before I ditched. But these guys, half of the mission was getting there, and the other half was getting back, because they know if they didn't get back, another poor crew is just going to have to go back and do the same thing. Oh, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. Okay, so introduce the people to us. Tell us about Jay and Joe, please.
Tom, I'll take this, and then you take the next one because it's so fresh in my mind. I was just speaking to someone about it. It's the spring of 1941. Jay Zeamer is just graduated from MIT. He's got an engineering degree, and he wants nothing so bad as to follow in the footsteps of his hero, Eddie Rickenbacker, the ace of World War I. Unfortunately, he's too tall. They don't want tall fighter pilots. So he's assigned to the 43rd Bomb Group, which was then based at Langley Airfield in Virginia. And not long after he arrives, he's watching a demonstration, an air show put on for the brass hats. That's what they call them. That is, it's like a bevy of politicians, War Department generals who had come down from Washington to see this nascent Army Air Force demonstration. Once again, there's no Air Force. It's the Army Air Force. Right. And so these air groups, the commanders always selected their best airmen for these shows. They wanted to put on a good show. They needed these guys to vote them budget money. And a bombardier named Joe Sarnoski is in the lead B-17 Flying Fortress. Jay is on the ground. He's a pilot. He's a co-pilot at this point. He's watching the show, and he sees this lead bombardier lay his eggs, as they called it, drop these 500-pound dummy bombs using the brand-new secret Norden bomb sight, by the way, within 75 feet of their intended target. Wow. And Jay is a curious guy. He's an engineer. He has to know, who is this hotshot bombardier? So he seeks out Joe. He offers to buy him a beer. Joe is a staff sergeant at the time, and here's a second lieutenant offering to buy him a beer. He's a little taken aback by this, but a friendship blooms.
That is amazing. So, like you were saying, Joe's background, if you will, and his experiences thus far on the story have been very different. Give us an idea of who this bombardier is.
Well, Joe Sarnoski, Joe and Jay Zeamer, both, the one thing they had in common is they were both actually born in Pennsylvania, although Jay grew up in New Jersey. Jay was somebody who grew up in basically what you would call a middle-class family situation economically, and he was able to go to good schools. He went to MIT. Joe was one of 15 kids, and he was from a family in the coal mining area of Pennsylvania, and he was one of the older siblings. He wasn't the oldest, but he was one of the older ones. So his situation growing up was everybody had to pitch in. His family had a farm, a small farm that they did. His father had worked in the coal mines, but he got too sick to work underground anymore, so he tried to be a farmer. And everybody, starting with the oldest child, the oldest son, and the older daughters, they trained basically the younger ones, and they kept having to have the kids as the kids came along and got old enough. They had their jobs to do, and Joe was a pretty enterprising guy. He not only worked very hard, but he played the accordion in a band. They make extra money doing weddings and special events, and he loved the idea of flying. It was probably because, one reason had to be because it was a way to escape that way of life, and it probably seemed very romantic to him. So the time finally came when, and this was several years before World War II, I think it was 1936, that Joe was old enough and his younger siblings were old enough that he could, lay down his chores on the farm and join the Army. And he ended up becoming a bombardier, and was somebody who really, as Jay found out, somebody who really got a lot of respect for his abilities.
You kind of hit it right, Ray. It was a kind of a Mutt and Jeff friendship, not so much from tall to short, but here's this middle-class kid who went to the Culver Military Academy in Indiana and MIT and wanted to be an engineer. And here's the fifth child of 16 who the quintessential, his parents were immigrants from Poland, quintessential coal mining country, Carbondale. And the fact that they were Pennsylvanians only adds to the dichotomy a little bit, that they became such fast friends.
Yeah, so two very young men, very different, obviously, obsessed with planes, obviously very intelligent, certainly not, as we're going to see later, they're certainly not ones who are obsessed with following orders. They're certainly mavericks in their own way. But as the war starts, World War II starts in 1939, they both assume that in some capacity they are going to be fighting against Hitler and his hordes, but that's not in their future. They're going to end up in the Pacific. Can you just give us an idea of kind of how they got out west instead of going into Europe?
Well, it's funny because before Jay was transferred out of the 43rd Bombardment Group and into the 22nd to test co-pilot B-26 Marauders. And before he left for Wright Field in Ohio, he and Joe would sit around joking. They knew America was going to be dragged into this war sooner or later. Mm-hmm. They had no idea that it was going to be on the other side of the world. They all thought they were going to Europe. They used to joke about dropping 500-pound bombs down the chimney of the Reichstag and ending the war early, and everybody goes home happy. But as it turns out, I'll take Jay's story, and I'll leave Joe's story to Tom. Jay, when he returns to Langley from his test piloting duties, since the 22nd Bomb Group is going to be receiving these B-22 Marauders, they called them the Widowmaker for two reasons. It was a kind of a double-edged sword. They carried such a payload, but they were also so difficult to land and to lift off that they killed so many of our own pilots. And so Jay is now in the 22nd Bomb Group. He's not happy about it. He fell in love with B-17s. That's what Joe is in the 43rd Bomb Group. Joe is a bombardier in the B-17 Flying Fortress. So Jay is actually in Boston on a weekend leave. He's flying back on December 7th, 1941, when he gets the news of Pearl Harbor. The entire crew got it. Right. And at first they didn't believe it. They thought, no, like the rest of the country, this cannot be. This is an Orson Welles War of the Worlds hoax over the radio. This can't be happening. And sure enough, they land, and they're on a war footing. Nobody was allowed to leave the base, and by the next morning, they were flying west to touch down in the Mojave Desert, where for the next month they took over West Coast submarine hunting duties off the coast of California and off the coast of Baja, Mexico. And, of course, they weren't happy about that. They wanted to get into the fray. They wanted to get over to England. Everybody wants to start bombing the Nazis, and here they are out in the middle of the desert, taking off every day and basically bombing whales. Oh, hey, that might be a sub. Let's bomb it. And it turns out to be a whale. Right. In the meanwhile, Joe is on the other end of the world. Right, Tom?
Well, Joe also fell when he was at Langley. Joe also fell in love, although it wasn't with a plane; it was with a woman named Marie Maddox, who was a native of Richmond, Virginia. And they fell in love, and then Joe was transferred up to a base in Maine. And that was going to be like his last assignment stateside. He knew, especially after Pearl Harbor, that he was going to be heading. Maybe he didn't know which theater he was heading to, but there was very little doubt he was going to be heading to one of the fronts. So he and Marie got married, and she went back to stay with her family in Virginia because there was really nothing for her to do up in Maine if he was being shipped out. So Joe ended up on the USS Argentina, which was a troop ship, and it had to make this rather perilous journey across the ocean to make its way gradually to Australia. And he was one of, these troop ships had buried thousands and thousands of American pilots, bombardiers, other technicians, ground crews over to the war zone, and some of them were hit by submarines. So it was not an easy journey. You never knew if the ship you were on was going to get attacked. So, and the conditions were pretty tough. These guys were sardined together on these ships. So it was that Joe and Jay both found themselves on the other side of the world, and eventually found each other and resumed what turned into a deeper friendship.
Okay, so you've got Pearl Harbor. Obviously, we have to deal with Japan. They have, and not that we have time for it here, but they have moved very swiftly, very decisively, taking a wide range of islands, knowing that the United States one day is going to come for them. So obviously, the United States Army and their planes are going to have to deal with these vast oceans of water that they have to deal with going from island to island. So could you give us a little information about what the Army, Air Force, or maybe what the Army was looking for when they ordered up the B-17 bomber?
Well, the Boeing Aircraft Company, the maker of the B-17, in fact, it was founded 100 years ago this year, in 1960. And they were building canvas and wood biplanes. And in 1934, like much of the rest of the country, they'd been hit hard by the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. And that was the year the government put out a contract bid. And they said the Army Air Force put out specs. They wanted a bomber that could fly a minimum of 250 miles per hour, reach a ceiling of 25,000 feet, and remain airborne from 6 to 10 hours. So Boeing, which only had $500,000 in their coffers, more or less pushed all their chips into the middle of the table. And the Boeing designers took those specs, went to work on what at first they called it wasn't called the Flying Fortress, Ray. It was called the Aerial Battle Cruiser. And within a year of that contract bid, the Flying Fortress literally came online. And the plane was a beast. It was 75 feet long. It had a wingspan of over 100 feet. It could carry a maximum of 5,000 pounds of ordnance for an incredible 1,700 miles. Mm-hmm. And in short, in Lucky 666, in our book, the B-17, not just Lucky 666, but all the B-17s, but Lucky 666, old 666 in particular, it's as much as a protagonist as Jay Zeamer is and as Joe Sarnoski is. And oh, by the way, it scared the hell out of the enemy across both oceans.
Imagine a service that picks up your laundry and returns it the next day, washed, fluffed, and perfectly folded, all to your exact specifications. That's Happy Nest. We know that customer satisfaction is everything, which is why we only partner with the best laundromats in your neighborhood. And by using high-efficiency, eco-friendly washers and dryers, we'll get your whites white while keeping the planet green. Save time for the important things and leave the laundry to us. To get started, download the app or go to happynest.com.
I sure did. So Jay is he eventually makes his way to Brisbane, Australia. He's with the 22nd Bomber Group. And even though this is deviating from the story, if you could just spend a couple of minutes on, after the Philippines are lost, the internal battle between, okay, we've lost that, we've lost so much with Pearl Harbor, but we're going to take the offensive one day. Someone's got to be in charge of all this. I did not at all appreciate the behind-the-scenes infighting as far as who is going to be in charge. If you could just give us a little information on that, please.
I could weigh in on that. The probably the biggest ego in the Southwest Pacific belonged to General Douglas MacArthur.
How about in the war?
Yeah,
good point.
Yeah. And he had been chased out of the Philippines, and there was the "I shall return," which has become such a catchphrase. But he ended up, with whatever little territory was left. He ended up in Australia, and he was not particularly well liked by a lot of other people and people who served for him. Certainly, the Marines didn't care for him very much. But he was the top dog militarily in that part of the world. I mean, he was even given, if I remember correctly, he was given the Medal of Honor just for escaping.
Wow.
Not for winning anything, but he managed to successfully escape. Well, that's good enough. Let's give him the Medal of Honor. But you had other people who were important figures in the American military then, Bull Halsey, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Ernest King, General George C. Marshall. These were the top brass in the American military. And so, as you mentioned in your question, there was some infighting going on because MacArthur basically said, I want everything under my command. I want even the Navy under my command. And cooler heads prevailed back in Washington, realizing what a mistake that would be to concentrate so much power into the hands of one man, and that the Navy needed to have its own, to some extent, autonomy. Obviously, everybody had to cooperate as best they could and work together against a common enemy. But there was some of that infighting that was eventually settled, where they literally picked a spot and said, okay, MacArthur has this up to this point he controls. Mm-hmm. The Navy, Nimitz and King and the Navy controls up to this point. One of the things we point out in the book that I think is a good story in Lucky 666 is that when Bull Halsey came on the scene, he's somebody also who was not a wallflower by any means either, but he and MacArthur actually got along famously. Halsey knew how to work MacArthur, and their eventual partnership in a lot of efforts made a big difference in the American when they finally were able to go on the offensive.
Okay, and this is going to figure into this story later on, but and we're going to go into this later. But I was just absolutely shocked about the scarcity of resources that was heading into the Pacific, and I was just dumbfounded by there's not enough maintenance crews, and we all know that the tip of a spear isn't very sharp unless you've got the people behind the scenes fixing and repairing and all that stuff. Can you just give us an idea of what transpires because there's not enough maintenance crews to go around for Jay and the other pilots like him?
Well, Ray, you mentioned before, you alluded to the scope of the Japanese conquests in the first year of World War II. I mean, we went from the Burma-India border in the west up to the Aleutians, the Kiska and Attu, the two westernmost Aleutian islands in the north, down to the Solomons and New Guinea in the south. And despite, I mean, that was 1/5 of the, although most of it was ocean, it was 1/5 of the Earth's surface. Wow. But to make matters even kind of odd, the Southwest Pacific Theater in particular, the Pacific Theater in general, and the Southwest Pacific Theater, which was under MacArthur's aegis, they were kind of the red-headed stepchild of the war. They were treated by Washington as a sort of rump-end sideshow, while President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and eventually the Soviets under Joseph Stalin pursued a Germany-first strategy. That was defeat the Nazis, and then we'll turn our attention to the Japanese. Right. So in the Southwest Pacific in particular, this meant interdict the Japanese supply lines when you can, bomb them when you can, just hold on. Right. Try not to let them invade Australia, basically. And we'll get to them after the Germans go under. But in practice, what this meant was that no new aircraft for that Southwest Theater, very few replacement air crews for those killed, wounded, or the thousands of Americans who went sick in the tropical environment, and hardly any spare parts. I mean, Australia had no air force to speak of. And maintenance crews for the American bombers and fighters were so few and far between that the flight crews themselves pulled double duty as both flyers and mechanics. They were repairmen. And some of the planes that went up in the Southwest Pacific, they went up looking like Rube Goldberg contraptions. but if the Americans are anything, we are innovative.
Yes.
And so the airmen found, for instance, that Australian sanitary napkins, Kotex in particular, made terrific air filters. And that at a pinch, the local Australian 6-pence coin provided just the right spark for an aircraft engine's ignition magneto. And so this is how we were operating on spit, duct tape, and glue for the longest time. And in the middle of this is our heroes, our protagonists, Zeamer and Joseph Sarnoski.
It's a good thing they're both engineers or, have an engineer bent to them because, like you said, they're going to be doing a lot of their own work.
Oh, goodness, yes. And it was, and one of the things that I think is not appreciated by it is just how, forget the lack of air crews, the lack of replacement planes, the lack of spare parts, is just how intolerable the bases were. Now, Australia wasn't too bad. It's funny, a lot of the Americans had no idea. They'd never been out of their hometowns, much less out of the country. Right. They were shocked to see that the Australians spoke English. And most of the Australian army, such as it was over in North Africa. So the Australians had nothing to defend them. They were, as Britain was awaiting the Nazi invasion, Australia was awaiting the Japanese invasion. And they actually had a secret plan to cede the top half of the continent to the Japanese. I think it was from Darwin down. And so this is the situation that Americans from both the 22nd Bomb Group and the 43rd Bomb Group, they're arriving in Australia, and this is what they're facing.
And the Japanese almost make it. I mean, they get to New Guinea, they're on the top half, they needed to come over, and I guess the next target for them is Port Moresby. And if they can take that, then they are truly one step away from landing in Australia.
One of the things that we wanted to do with Lucky 666 is make sure there's plenty of maps in there. People like maps, so they can make sure they know what the geography is. And what's called end papers, we have a map that shows in 1941-42 the extent of the Japanese the control, what territory they controlled, and it comes right up to part of New Guinea, right across the water from Australia. And again, I think that people don't quite recognize or appreciate how close to extinction the Allied effort was early in the war. And I sort of liken it to it's like a prize fight. The Allies spent most of their time on the canvas, and there was the occasional counterpunch, like Doolittle's raid against Tokyo in April 1942. And yes, Midway was a counterpunch, but they were barely hanging on. They were barely staying conscious. There was, at any moment the ref was going to count them out. And so I think that's part of the story that is really fascinating to me is how close the Allies were to having their ability to wage any further war completely extinguished by the very confident Japanese.
And the Japanese knew this too, Ray. They knew if they could take Australia, they would cut off the American. The only lifeline to Australia was America. Ships coming in. And once they took Australia, their reasoning was Americans will probably fall back to Hawaii. They might even fall back to the West Coast just to defend themselves. So we need to take Australia. That's why this was so important.
That's amazing. But even then, like you were saying, the Americans did counterpunch. You have the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. If I could get y'all to just touch on that for me, and again, how that kind of affects the lone Port Moresby just sitting there, just waiting to be taken, but their allies are fighting as best they can to hold on to it.
Tom, how about I take Coral Sea, you take Midway? What do you think?
Go right ahead.
All right. So it's the first week of May, 1942. And in preparation for their invasion of Australia, the Japanese at Rabaul on the island of New Britain, the bastion of Rabaul, it's the Gibraltar of the Japanese. They dispatched troop ships out of Rabaul to invade and capture Port Moresby. Now, Port Moresby on the southeastern tip of the west coast of Papua New Guinea is the last Allied stronghold on that giant island. And the Australians are based there, but we don't even put American planes in there. They come in to refuel, they come in to reform, and they don't even turn their engines off when they do refuel because the Japanese are bombing it every day. So this Japanese flotilla of troop ships, flanked by warships, which are anchored by aircraft carriers, on their way to invade Port Moresby, take Port Moresby, that's going to open up Australia for invasion. This fleet is intercepted by a smaller American fleet before they can reach New Guinea. And for the first time in history, there's a sea battle where no ships fire on each other. The entire fight was conducted by aircraft flying off the carriers and some Allied planes lifting off from Australia. And it is, in terms of technical, how many ships lost, it was kind of a draw. But in terms of morale, it was a decisive American victory. Both in the Southwest Pacific, in the Pacific as a whole, and on the home front. It was the first time, Tom's analogy, it's the first time we got up off the canvas and landed a good punch. More than that, though, it freed up Port Moresby. Now the powers that be, MacArthur, his chief air general, they say, you know what? Even though Port Moresby is still being bombed every day, we think it might be safe enough to station air groups there. And so now air groups start moving into Port Moresby, including the 43rd Bomb Group. And then Midway comes along, and I don't know, some consider it a turning point of the war. Tom and I disagree. Tell them why, Tom.
Well, I mean, Midway was, yes, it's always been considered a victory for the Allied forces, the Americans. But Midway by itself did not guarantee by any means that the Allies were going to win the Pacific War. It was a big help in the sense that it was another one of the battles that were becoming more and more frequent in which Navy forces didn't actually engage each other directly. Their planes did, but ships did not engage each other directly. I mean, that had always been the history of sea warfare, where ships getting close enough to each other where they could do damage to each other. And now the idea was, let's stay far enough away from each other, we'll launch our planes at each other. But Midway did help in the sense that it was, I believe it sank, was it 3 Japanese carriers or 4? Sank or damaged those carriers. And one of the things that made that very important, aside from taking those carriers out of action, is that the Japanese did not have the ability that the Americans had or proved to have as the war went on to manufacture, to replace aircraft carriers and other ships. You know, you look at something like the USS Lexington. The USS Lexington was sunk in 1942, and there was, before the war ended, there was another USS Lexington. You know, that was fighting in the Pacific theater. So it was a big help to the Allied effort, Midway. But it did not mean that, okay, the war's over, it's a turning point, we've got the Japanese on the defensive now. That was still to come, and that really was more in the province of the Solomon Islands, which is, you know, a big part of what Lucky 666 is about how the Solomon Islands, as Bob was explaining earlier, and Bougainville did represent a pivotal point in the war.
Ray, it's kind of our contention that, yes, Midway was a big blow to the Japanese and a big victory for the United States. But until that airbase at Rabaul, I know I keep coming back to Rabaul, but until that airbase at Rabaul on New Britain was nullified, I don't think there was a turning point until that occurred. And that couldn't occur, I'm jumping way ahead of myself, until we took Bougainville. But since you're the podcast runner, I'll let you get back to asking questions. Sorry to jump in.
No problem. Yeah, because Rabaul is where they're projecting their power from. So, yeah, that is got to be taken at some point. So let's get back to Jay for a second. I don't know if this was the time of World War II or men in war, but I had a hard time grasping the two different Jays. One, when he was in the air, total professional, but yet still trying to just not think inside the box, versus when he was on the ground. Can you give us an idea of what Jay's superiors had a problem with him at times?
Well, he's still with the 22nd, co-piloting B-26s. And he's known as a great guy, good guy on the ground. Hell of a pilot in the left seat, the pilot seat, of almost any other bomber, except the B-26. For some reason, for some mental tick, he just can't stick the landings and the takeoffs, and he can't get his pilot's accreditation. So he took part in many bombing missions over Rabaul, and the fact that he was a co-pilot kind of was twisting his mind. And at At one point, the 22nd was flying almost daily bombing runs over Rabaul and other Japanese. You mentioned the bases on the north coast of New Guinea, such as Lae and Silamia. I probably pronounced them wrong, but I think I may have gotten close, on New Guinea's north coast. And Jay's heart just isn't in it. And for instance, despite explicit commands from bomber control to wear your entire uniform, he's going up in Australian bush shorts and Australian knee socks. He's even carrying an old World War I helmet he picked up somewhere. And finally, on one bombing raid over Lae, he's partnered with a rookie pilot who's just arrived in theater. And Jay Zeamer later wrote that he was so bored as a co-pilot that he fell asleep during the bomb run. And the rookie pilot, is banging on his chest. He's trying to wake him up. And well, they get back. The rookie pilot writes him up saying, I'm not flying with this guy again. And the 22nd at the time, they were so shot up. Their morale was so low. They were the first people in there, and they were just getting killed. And their commander figured, listen, maybe if I ship this bad apple out, he liked Jay, but if I ship this guy out of my unit, maybe morale will pick up. And that's how Jay wound up back in the 43rd Bomb Group, and that's where our story in Lucky 666 really takes off.
So the Japanese are having trouble. They've been dealt a blow. They've got to come back at Australia. But there's going to be another commander, if you will, of the 5th Air Force. Could you tell us a little bit about George Kenney? And I just love the way that he was able to find a way to work with MacArthur.
Yeah, George Kennedy was kind of a bulldog kind of guy. He had a lot of experience dating back to World War I, and he was also an inventive guy, and he had been part of innovations involving the Army Air Corps. And MacArthur's head of aviation, the head of the Air Forces for MacArthur, was just not doing his job. I mean, it was a very, very difficult job to do because, as we talked about, the lack of resources, but still, MacArthur needed somebody who was going to really take charge and turn this whole Air Force business around. And in fact, Eddie Rickenbacker was one who was considered for the job, but MacArthur didn't want that because basically he didn't want to share the stage with somebody who was as famous as he was. So along comes George Kenney, and even though Kenney was a tough guy, and of course he had his own ego, he went in to see MacArthur, and he went in and said, listen, you're the boss. I realize that. We're not going to butt heads over territory and ego or anything like that. I'm going to do my best to turn this Air Force around, and I understand ultimately you're the boss. I do need some independence. I need some wiggle room here for how I'm going to do it. And MacArthur took a shine to Kenney and said, I like this guy. I like his straight talk. I like a guy who's going to say I'm the boss. And I like a guy who's going to basically 24/7, he's going to work on turning what became the 5th Air Force into a very powerful offensive weapon. So he's one of my favorite characters in Lucky 666, George Kenney, because he really came, and he really inspired the loyalty of the men. There are a couple of different stories that we offer in the book about how, to this day, they're called Ken's Men. And you can even go on kensmen.com. There's a wonderful website that they have. And one of the most likely reasons is that because they named themselves after George C. Kenney, they were Ken's Men.
Wow. And
think about Kenney, too. He surrounded himself. He stood up to MacArthur. He, as Tom mentioned, he said, listen, I know you're the boss, and I'll be loyal to you, but you better be loyal to me and my men, or else you'll be receiving a telegram from San Francisco saying I quit. But Kenney surrounded himself with this cast of characters who Tom and I just fell in love with. There was a major named Bill Benn. In fact, on the way from the States, Kenney was assuming command in August of 42, and on the flight from the States, they stopped over at one of the atolls. I forget off the top of my head which one right now. And Bill Benn said to him, you know about skip bombing, right? And Kenney, of course, knew about it. The British had tried it against Nazi shipping in the North Sea. but it was so dangerous, and they were losing so many planes. It's when you come in with a bomber, like 200 feet off the deck, and you literally skip your bombs across the sea into the side of a ship. And Bill Benn was such a skip bomb aficionado. He took George Kenney up in a plane with some dummy bombs on his atoll and said, "See that coral reef down there? I'm going to skip bomb." And he hit like 5 of 8. And Kenny said, "All right, Bill, tell you what, I'm going to give you your own special unit. I'm going to put this guy Ken McCullough in charge of it, who was right underneath Bill Benn. Mm-hmm. And you and Ken, you figure out how to do this." Because at the time, everybody's heard, the PT movie with John Wayne, The Slot. We were clawing our way across Guadalcanal, and the Japanese were reinforcing Guadalcanal, and they were sending their ships, their troop ships and their supply ships down what was called the Slot, which was kind of a waterway that bisected the Solomon Island chain. And we were having no luck whatsoever with high altitude bombing, trying to sink these ships. And boom, next thing you know, Bill Benn, Ken McCullough, and Jay Zeamer, who starts flying with Ken McCullough, they're out there skip bombing the hell out of these ships. Now Jay feels rejuvenated.
Right.
He realizes that first of all, it's a B-17 with the right man in the left seat. that is, when the right man piloting a B-17 Flying Fortress, it'll handle like a fighter pilot. Mm-hmm. So Jay starts volunteering. He flies with McCullough 6 or 7 times, and because so many men were down sick, he starts volunteering as a pilot. He still doesn't pass his flight test as a pilot. He just has a great feel for the B-17. And of course, any commander says, "I'll take anybody who can fly these things." So he begins to go up in his own B-17, and he begins picking dogfights with shocked Japanese Zero pilots. Are like, "Wait a minute, what's this B-17 doing coming down on me like this?" He had learned this from Ken McCullough, who had learned it from Bill Benn, who had been one of General Kenny's right-hand men. So there's a lineage that outside of MacArthur's aegis, that this is all going on, and this is what really interested. I'm getting a little off topic here, but I'll say one thing, and I'll try to say it quickly.
Sure.
This book, Lucky 666, we feel like it's peeling an onion. On the outside is the situation early in the war in the Pacific, specifically the Southwest Pacific during World War II. You peel the next layer, and you have the 43rd Bomb Group. And we could have written a book about Bill Benn. We could have written a book about Ken McCullough or George Kenney. And then you peel it even deeper, and you get to the center, and you get to Jay Zeamer and the Eager Beavers and Joe Sarnoski and what they called the Misfits. And then you peel the final layer, and then you get to the mission that I'm jumping way ahead of myself. that resonated with the award of 2 Medal of Honors, the only time that's ever happened in either the Air Force or the U.S. Army Air Force. I'll shut up now.
That's fine. And I just had to mention this one thing, even though it's a small fact, but it just blew me away. I think y'all said in the book somewhere that roughly 12% of U.S. resources were going to the Pacific, and so Kenny comes along and he's able to improve conditions. He's able to improve what the men have to work with, but still, it's just absolute paltry compared to what the men fighting against Germany and Italy are getting a hold of.
Well, Tom, tell them about how we like the fact the Mighty 8th was based in England, and that was the Mighty 8th Air Force. And we like writing about the forgotten 5th.
Yeah, it's true. It was the forgotten 5th, and it was the Kenny tried to improve conditions on the ground. The food was abysmal. He tried to give his men maybe some more downtime between missions because they were all exhausted, and they were one mission after another, and it's because there just weren't enough of them to go around. And the other thing that has to be understood about these missions that Jay and other pilots were going on that differed from the European ones is that their targets were not nearby. You could take off from a base in England and you could be flying over France, an hour or something like that. Mm-hmm. But in the Pacific, you may be flying 4 hours, 5 hours one way to get to your target, and then coming back. And not only was that just physically draining to have to spend that so much time in the air on these B-17s that were freezing cold on the inside. There were very few comforts in a B-17. But not only did you have to deal with that kind of discomfort, but you had to do these missions that took a lot longer, and then go right back up there the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the exposure to enemy fighters. At least if you were flying in Europe, you were out of harm's way fairly quickly because you got back over Allied territory. But there were miles and miles and miles of open water where any Japanese squadron could suddenly find you and attack. So the Forgotten Fifth, what some people also might forget about them is that some of the risks, not to belittle anything that was going on with the Army Air Force in Europe, but the Forgotten Fifth, those pilots, those crews, really had the deck stacked against them. Yet they kept, every day those who were fit for duty showed up to fly again.
Amazing. Now I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit, just to in the interest of time. But I do have to mention real quick again, your book has everything in it, including the kitchen sink. You mentioned that as much as George Kenney was able to do, the one thing he seemed to be unable to do was improve the food that these guys had to eat. And Jay, if I remember, Jay got down to an incredibly low weight, just a stick of a man. They just didn't have the resources I guess they needed.
Well, the sick bay was constantly full. Beriberi, jungle rot, malaria. The Americans weren't used to this, and Jay never got sick. That was funny. But I will say this about Jay. I know we're jumping ahead, but even though he's now in the 43rd, now he's flying B-17s, what he loves to do. You couldn't take all of the scoundrel out of the man. I mean, at one point, they were flying a mission over, I believe it was Salamanca or Leh, and they were ordered. Oh no! It was a recon mission over. He went up alone with a crew in a recon mission over Rabaul. They needed photos. Kenny and MacArthur had heard there was some kind of big buildup in Rabaul Harbor, and they wanted to know what was going on. But they were ordered not to go below 20,000 feet to take these photos. Well, he gets there, 5-hour trip. There's a cloud cover, and he says, 5 hours, the hell with this. So they fly down through, take the photos, giant dogfight. They're getting blasted all the way home. And then when they get over Dobodura, the fighting is still going on at Dobodura. He takes out 3 zeros, and he wins the Silver Star. And afterward, the navigator, who he had never flown with before, comes up to him, punches him in the face, and says, "I'm never flying with you again." We were told not to go below 20,000 feet. What are you doing going down to 4,000 feet? Another time was a strafing mission over Madang. Jay's B-17 was the first one in, and they were explicitly warned, do not, it was a bombing mission over Madang, and they were explicitly warned, do not strafe. We're not going to lose one of our precious B-17s because you're going in so low to strafe. Mm-hmm. Well, Jay was leading the formation, and they all knew at night when the lead bomber rarely faced anti-aircraft, ACAC, because it took the Japanese gun crews a while to get zeroed in, to get to their places. Mm-hmm. So Jay gets in. Joe Sarnoski's flying with him now. Joe drops all his bombs, and they're looking. They see a line of bombers explode. They've done their job. They vector out over the Coral Sea. Now they're just supposed to wait for the rest to come in. I think there were 7 B-17s in that flight. And Jay says, the hell with this. Look at all the lights in the sky. Look at all the tracers. These guys are going to get killed. So Jay leads the second plane in and strafes the hell out of the searchlights. Then he leads the third plane in, the fourth plane in, explicitly against orders. He gets back. He gets thrown in the brig. He's about to be court-martialed. But there's a visiting newspaperman, an AP wire service guy. He finds out about this story, talks to the other pilots, who all say, Jay Zeamer saved our life by taking out those searchlights. He wins his second Silver Star. I mean, as I say, you couldn't take the scoundrel out of the man.
That's amazing. But he was getting the job done. I mean, he knew the larger objective, and sometimes the orders get in the way, and that just seems to be the type of person he was. So Jay and Joe are reunited. But for a while, they're frustrated because Jay is still not technically a pilot, and Joe's instructing other bombers. He's not being a bomber. And so they come up with their own idea because they're both Mavericks. They're going to work together, and they want to get their own crew together. And I just can't help but feel that a part of this war theater in the Southwest Pacific was almost like the Wild West. You could get away with stuff as long as you produced results. And so they come up with this idea to build their own crew because they just want an opportunity to contribute to the war, not just train bombers or just to be a co-pilot, but they want to put their own crew together. But again, no one's asking them to do this. And if you could just tell us a little bit about their crew, please.
Well, step one, yes, was to put together their own crew, and step two would end up being building their own B-17 so the crew could have something to fly. But Jay and Joe were recruiting people from other squads to come. They would get a navigator, they would get a flight engineer, they would get a guy who would handle the waist guns, they would get somebody who, George Kendrick, who handled the waist guns and also was their main photographer, and Johnny Abel, who was a sergeant, and he was all of 19 years old, was their flight engineer. So they would get, it was basically guys who could be spared, or other pilots would say, "Yeah, take this guy. He's a misfit. You can, if you want him, you can have him." Well, Jay wanted him. Come on, let's go. And so these guys, Willie Vaughn and Pudge Pugh, and they all had their idiosyncrasies, let's put it that way. But when they got together under the command of Jay Zeamer and to some extent Joe Sarnoski as the older and more experienced guy, they all bonded together very, very strongly. They sort of had a kinship. They had the same kind of spirits in that way. Renegades, misfits, sort of like a Dirty Dozen kind of group, and they were fiercely loyal to Jay. And the next thing they had to do is, once they started flying together on other planes, is they wanted to, we want our own B-17. We want something that we can go up there, and they eventually got called the Eager Beavers, as Bob alluded to before, because they were the ones who were saying, "Yeah, we'll do that mission, we'll do that job, we'll do this." But it would be a different story that if they could have their own plane and they could fly more regularly and not be waiting around until they could, somebody else couldn't go up that day and they could use their plane. So that's what happened as far as the crew, and I think Bob could probably tell you how they ended up with a plane that got called the Old 666.
Right. Well, I tell you, the crew. I have a different crew member every day. Right. One day it's George Kendrick. He was the waist gunner, the camera, pool hustler from California. He boxed in college. Tom mentioned 19-year-old Johnny Abel, tow-headed, blonde-haired kid. We have a picture. We have a picture of the whole crew in the book, several. And he wanted to fly so much, but he was such a whiz with a wrench. He was on the maintenance crew that the grounds crew chiefs, they didn't want to lose him. So, but Jay kind of took him. Jay would have these, what he called his chin fests, where he talked strategy, how to take it to the jet. I know that's not politically correct today, but that's how they would take it. That's how they would call it at the time. Johnny Abel, Jay kind of put it in the back of his mind, this guy might make a good flight engineer, and he saw he was a good shot. In the sense, he'd make a pretty swell top turret gunner. Pudge Pugh, who Tom mentioned, Pugh was a very ironic nickname. This guy was a Jack LaLanne buff. He looked like a young Arnold Schwarzenegger. He became the tail gunner. How they fit him in the tail gun, how he crawled back through that tailpipe. And it was freezing back there. He's sitting on this bicycle-like seat for 6 hours, 8 hours. The windows are icing up. And the belly gunner, Forrest Dillman, there was a height cutoff, 5'4". Forrest wanted to fly so badly that he said, "Okay, I'll be your belly gunner." And that position had the highest percentage of deaths on any. But as I said when I started this harangue, I have a different favorite crew member every day, and I think today it's Willie Vaughn. 22 years old, grew up wanting to fly, and earlier in the war, when the Japanese tried to land at Milne Bay and the southeast tip of New Guinea, Willie had been the radio operator on a B-17, and they had landed to quick refuel, and his squad, the 6 B-17s who had landed, they were trapped by a Japanese Marine ambush. And so they quickly took off their machine guns, their 50s cals and their 30 cals, and they formed a circle, and And they went through like a 12-hour gunfight with their machine guns. Finally, they ran out of bullets, but so did the Japanese. So Willie Vaughan killed 2 guys with his sidearm, ran out of bullets, threw his gun at the next guy, who bayoneted him. The Japanese bayoneted him in the neck. Willie just ducked his head in time, took his knife out, and killed the Japanese Marine. And when Jay Zeamer heard this, for some reason he said, you know what? I think I need a knife fighter at 30,000 feet. You know, this guy's going to be my radio man. So
Yeah. So he's my guy.
And as Tom said, they did not have their own plane. So there was a scrapyard down at the end of the Port Moresby runway, and there was an old junked up plane down there that had been cannibalized by all kinds of crew chiefs. And they said, you know what? This is our plane. This is our plane. We're going to, and its tail number was 666. So they started calling it Old 666. They didn't even give it a name like Take This Tojo or Bombs Away or that kind of thing. And they rebuilt it basically from the ground up. And Jay liked guns. Oh, did Jay like guns? Most B-15s, or maybe, most B-17s had 13 guns, about half of them 30 cals. Jay took out all the 30 cals. He stripped the plane of all its extraneous metal. He lost about a ton from it. And then he put in 19 50 cals. Everybody on that plane had 250 cals. And they rebuilt old 66, and they finally got it flight worthy. And it was just about to be assigned when the brass found out, hey, we got another B-17 down here. It's good. They were going to assign another crew to it. They started sleeping on the plane and letting everybody know, our guns are loaded. Don't try to take the plane from us. So the commander told the other crew to back off, and Jay and the crew took it up, and they got it flight worthy. And the next thing you know, here we are. We're here. We're here at your doorstep every morning, as regular as the Angelus. We're volunteering for any mission you got.
That is amazing. So General Kenny is looking for someone to take pictures of Bougainville because the Marines are coming, and I guess the Army as well, but I'm not sure. I don't want to impugn them. But basically, like you said,
the Army was part of that invasion also, yes.
Gotcha. So they need information. So again, so General Kenny's looking for someone, because if they can get on Bougainville, then they can reach Rabaul, as we've said, is a very important spot as far as this section of the war, and the bombers would be able to be protected by fighters, but first they got to get there. So they've got they're planning the invasion, they're getting everything together, but like you gentlemen have said, they need detailed information. Because they got to have their men, they got to have their ships, they got to have everything. So this is obviously going to be a very dangerous mission, and General Kennedy, I guess, didn't feel comfortable just ordering a crew, so I guess he's putting out the word that he's looking for volunteers.
He did, and Jay happened to be, his ears were very big. He heard that this call for volunteers had gone out, and he did discuss it with his crew. They were the Eager Beavers, but still, this was a different operation. This was, he even said to them, he said, my feeling is that we have maybe a 10% chance of surviving this mission. And all the other guys said, yeah, count me in. And so Jay had discussed it with his crew first, and he went back to his, senior officers and said, okay, we're the guys. And they realized, I think they all realized as one, that this was going to be the ultimate test of their plane, their B-17. I think of their own courage. I think they realized it was going to be the ultimate test of their bonding, their group strength, and their faith in each other, and their faith with the other crew members, their faith in Jay Zeamer as their pilot. And something very important to mention is that they did sign up for the mission. The date was picked. They had to sort of depending on making sure the weather was okay. And Joe Sarnoski's tour of duty was up. He had been stationed over there for a while, and he was told, okay, it's your turn to be rotated back to the States. And a couple of the crew members, I think it was a day before or a couple of days before the mission, which was taking place on June 16, 1943, came down with malaria. And so Joe's bags were packed, And he said, "You know what? I'm going up with you guys. I can't let you go on this mission without me. I'm part of this crew, and maybe he was being superstitious. It would be bad luck if he wasn't with them." So his bags were literally packed, and he went to Jay, and they consider each other best friends, and said, "You're not flying without me."
That's amazing. And so again, but we have to remember, there's going to be no bombs on this plane. You don't need a bomb, but
right. Right, but there was a brand new. He had to Jay, the crew members that went down with malaria were the co-pilot and the navigator, and these are two new guys going up. And of course, the navigator sits in the nose with the bombardier. And Joe said, "I have all the faith in the world in this new navigator." And he was a tough guy too, but it can't hurt to have an extra pair of eyes, and it can't hurt to have an extra pair of guns manning the twin 50 cals up there.
Right, but when someone says, "Look, you've got about 10% chance of coming back alive, and your bags are packed," the bond between these men must have been incredible for him to go, "No, I'll go. You need me. I want to go."
Yes, and Joe, I think, personifies that kind of spirit that the men had. He could have easily, by the time that at 4:00 in the morning on June 16th, that old 66 was lifting off the airstrip, he could have easily been already on a ship on his way back to America. He was married, remember, too. He had left his wife back there. He could have easily gone back and said, "Okay, I'm going to go back. I'll be on leave with my wife, and then I'll probably be stateside training people for the rest of the war." But I think he personified that bond, that closeness that they had, and again, loyalty to Jay Zeamer. That can't be underestimated. That Jay Zeamer, our main character, one of the things we wanted to make sure we showed in that book was he was a man of extraordinary personality and character and integrity, and that the men responded to that.
Not to mention a misfit and a screw-up.
Yes, that too.
Ray, they actually used the word, back in 1941-42, the word screw-up was comparable to a swear word. And yet we dug up newspaper stories and magazine articles where they actually called this crew the screw-ups.
So let me just say one thing, and then I'll let you gentlemen get started with the mission. So one of the things that Jay developed as one of his tactics is when he would spot a zero, he would turn into them and fly at them, knowing that they would, lift up and go over him, which would give his gunners a chance to really get a good shot at him. But what he's about to do, he can't use that because they've got to hold very still for these photos. So if you could just real quickly tell me about the camera that they're going to use, the type of photos that they need, and then get us started on the story. And obviously Jay gets very bad news just as they're about to take off because they want to alter this already very dangerous mission.
So Lucky 666 is equipped with all bombers had some type of camera on them, but Lucky 666 is equipped with these three trimetragon cameras that can photograph 20 feet below. Remember, we talked about the reefs before of Empress Augusta Bay? Mm-hmm. They can cut through fog, and they can cut through water 20 feet. And so they're up there, but in order to get the perfect photos for the Army Corps of Engineers who are going to make the invasion maps, he can't deviate from course. He has to fly at 25,000 feet at 200 miles per hour. If he tips his wing 1 inch in either direction, it's going to throw the photos off by a mile. Wow. So that's one of the reasons it's a suicide mission, because I can't use evasive action. We can't fight these guys. We have to take these photos. That's our job. So they're taxiing down the runway on June 16th at 4 a.m., and suddenly a Jeep screeches to a halt in front of them. They're the only plane out there. They're the only plane going up. And somebody gets out of the Jeep and says, Jay had been told, he had been called earlier that, listen, Buka, which is a small appendage island to Bougainville, as long as you're there, there's an airport on Buka. We think there might be 8 or 12 zeros there. Could you take some photos of that? And he said, no, I'm going up for Bougainville. Well, if we're going to go to Buka, they're going to have time to come up and get me over Bougainville. Why don't we just give them the date and time that we're coming? I'm not photographing Buka. But this Jeep screeches up. Somebody jumps out, hands a note to the waist gunner, George Kendrick. He runs it up to the cockpit. Jay reads it, and the note basically says, you're ordered by this general to photograph Bouga. Jay doesn't think it's real. He thinks it's bogus, but he doesn't say anything. They take off. They get over the Owen Stanleys, and now they have a 5-hour trip ahead of them. No military organization is a democracy, Ray. You know this.
Right,
but this crew is so tight. He gets on the intra radio, the intraplane radio, and he says, "Boys, I'm passing this note around. Let me know what you think." And he passes the note around. And so finally, 4 hours later, Bougainville hoves into view, and pick it up, Tom.
Well, they're early. They got there sooner than they expected to, and everything seems kind of calm. And so Jay basically says, "Well, what do you think? Should we go? Let's do the Bouga thing." Okay, let's do it. So they're photographing Bouga, and then they start on Bougainville, and they're taking their photographs. And the belly gunner notices that there's maybe 24 or so Japanese Zeros on the one of the airstrips. And he sees them beginning to taxi, and that tells them, uh-oh, they spotted it. And you have to think of what it must have been like from the Japanese point of view. And I should mention in the book, Lucky 666, we have translated after-action reports that were filed by the Japanese commander of the squadron, that they look up in the sky, and there's a lone B-17. There's no fighter escort. There's no squadron of B-17s. One flying fortress by itself. Well, let's go up there and blast this thing out of the sky. It's a sitting duck. And it was indeed a sitting duck because, as Bob mentioned before, Jay could see those flyers coming up, higher and higher towards his bomber. And he couldn't take evasive action. He had to keep, until George Kendrick, the photographer, said, "I got all the shots I need," they had to stay on a very straight and steady line. So it was sort of like if you're walking down the street and people are going to be hitting you, you can tell people are gearing up and they're each going to give you a punch. You can't turn your face. You've got to keep walking that straight line with your face straight ahead. That's what they faced. And then as soon as George Kendrick did give the word and say, "Okay, let's get out of here," Jay headed for home, but that was just the beginning of what turned out to be the longest dogfight in aviation history.
Yeah, so the Zeros, it took them a while, but they caught up to them, and I think, if I remember correctly, they were going to get in front of the plane and then fly at it and attack the front. Obviously, you want to be able to damage the cockpit, you want to be able to kill the pilots or whatever. So if you can give us an idea of the first couple of minutes when the Japanese Zeros start attacking.
Well, standard Japanese air warfare had it that these Zeros were so fast, get out in front of an American bomber, turn around, and its most vulnerable spot is the nose. Mm-hmm. And what they hadn't counted on was not only had Jay installed 250 caliber machine guns at Joe Sarnoski's bombardier station, right in the nose. They called it the greenhouse. Not only had he installed 250 caliber machine guns at the Navigator, I was going to say Willie Vaughn. Not Willie Vaughn. Who's the Navigator, Tom? I'm drawing a blank. I'm having a senior moment. Not only had he installed 250 caliber in the Navigator's compartment, but his belly gunner, who was also a kind of a fix-it guy, Jay had asked, when they were building old 666, Jay had said, "I want a gun to fire." So they had installed a 50 that he could fire from his steering wheel. No other plane in theater had this. Wow. I don't think any plane in Europe had it either. So these first couple of Japanese fighters that are coming in, we got this guy now. He's on a steady course. He's at 200 miles per hour. He's at 25,000 feet. He's not veering. There was a cloud cover they noticed. He's not making for the cloud cover. He must be taking photos. We're just going to take him down. All of a sudden, the first three Japanese planes are just blowing out of the sky with all this firepower. But the third guy did get a cannon shot off. Mm-hmm. And he strafed the nose, and he got a cannon shot off that exploded in the nose, sent Joe Sarnoski flying 15 feet backward. The Navigator crawled over to him, saw a hole in the side, as he put it in a letter, as big as a bowling ball, and it also blew out the entire cockpit. So Jay has no instruments left, and now he looks down, and he's like, "Wow, my leg looks like a delicatessen. There's shards of flesh just peeling off his left leg. His left knee looks like a raw hamburger. He looks over. His co-pilot is slumped in the seat. He doesn't know if he's dead. He's just kind of in his straps. He's leaning forward. But here comes more zeros, and he's got to keep fighting.
Now, so Jay's hurt. Joe's hurt really bad. Joe's got, a serious wound to his neck, and I think in his torso, the side. But at some point, he gets up and he starts manning his gun again. I mean, I guess it was the adrenaline or whatever, but they're going to give it their all, knowing that they have to make it home.
Well, Joe is a tough guy. I remember he's one of 16 kids from coal country in Pennsylvania, and he was severely wounded, but he could still fire a machine gun, and they were still being attacked. So it wasn't like he was going to say, "Medic, I'm out of action." There is no out of action at 25,000 feet when there's only 9 of you in a B-17. So yes, he went back to his machine gun and started firing. And everybody's firing a gun, because this is when this particular flying fortress was the most heavily armed flying fortress in the Pacific. And they were, as fast as they could fire their machine guns, they were battling these Zeros that were coming in. And this went on for not just 5 minutes or 10 minutes, that dogfights usually last. This went on for 40 minutes as old 666 kept trying to make it back, because, again, we mentioned this very early on, but what was so important is that this plane had to make it back. It wasn't enough that, let's say, it got so badly damaged that they ditched the plane and maybe the crew survived in a life raft. Right. They needed to get back with this very valuable film. And so they were fighting not only for their lives, but they were fighting for the lives of all those thousands of Marines who were going to hit that beach, who needed the correct intel to save many of their lives.
And during this dogfight, Ray, I remember, by the way, I have a junior moment. Ruby Johnson was a navigator. Mm-hmm. Ruby Johnson is hit in the neck after Jay crawls back to his gun. The radio man, Willie Vaughn, he's also hit. And Johnny Abel, up in the top turret, he shoots down another Zero, but he takes machine gun bullets in both legs. He falls out. I don't know if you've ever seen the top turret. It's kind of like a swing they sit in up there. He falls out of the swing because now their oxygen is on fire. And Jay realizes their little oxygen bottles are only going to last him another 30 seconds. He's got to get down below 10,000 feet so they can all breathe. So he goes into this steep dive. Johnny Abel falls out, hit in both legs. He figures, he looks at the co-pilot who's just slumped over. He looks at Jay. He figures Jay's dead, but he's like, oh, Jay's alive. He went into this dive on purpose. And then Johnny notices that the oxygen right behind the cockpit, the oxygen supply for the entire plane is on fire. He starts putting it out with his bare hands. He's burning his hands. Ruby Johnson comes up and helps him. Jay takes a look at Ruby Johnson. Now, because the whole control panel is blown out, Jay can look down between his legs and see Joe Sarnoski slumped over his guns, and he can see Ruby Johnson firing. But Ruby Johnson has so much blood on his face, and because the greenhouse is blown out, it's coagulating, it's freezing, and Jay says his head looks like a beet. And Ruby can't see, but he can hear. And when he hears the little whine of a Zero, he just starts firing. But then he comes up to help put out the fire. So the whole crew is basically, they're staying away from George Kendrick. George Kendrick in the waist is buying them some time because he's done taking the photos, and now he's banging planes to either side. George didn't want 2 waist gunners. A lot of B-17s had 2 waist gunners. George was like, he was the pool shark. He was like, no, these guns are all mine. All mine. So he's jumping from port to starboard, which is buying Jay an extra couple of minutes because the Japanese Zeros have to go further out wide before they could turn around and attack old 66 from the nose again. So Jay's looking down, and finally the co-pilot wakes up, and it turns out, miraculously, all he's got is a big lump on the side of his head. The explosion in the cockpit only banged his head back, and he's trying to convince Jay. He's looking at Jay's leg. Jay, at this point, has 180 pieces of shrapnel in him, including like pieces of rubber from the blown-out rudder. He's got nothing on the control panel. He's kind of guessing at what altitude they're at from the sound of the engines. And the co-pilot is trying to say, Jay, get out of there and go get bandaged up. He said, I'm not leaving this seat till we're home. We're home safe. And
Wow.
I don't know.
Let me just throw this out real quick. So, let's see here. Like Tom was saying, so this dogfight goes on for 40 minutes. It's gone on for 100 miles, but eventually the fighters have to peel off because they're running out of fuel, which is convenient because old 6.6 is almost out of bullets itself. And
Right.
You translated the Japanese after-action reports. Can you give us an idea of what they threw at old 6.66 and its crew?
Well, we have in the book actually, you know, how much they attacked it, you know, how many cannon shots they got off, how many bullets they got off, and when, according to the leader of the squadron, they believe that old 666 had plunged into the sea.
Right.
Because they saw a very, very severely damaged bomber that was in a deep dive. So their after-action report said that we didn't see it hit the ocean, but you know that was inevitable because this thing was going down. So when they broke off that attack, they, like you say, because they wouldn't have enough fuel to get back to their base if they hadn't. They would go back to their superiors and said, "Yep, we took care of that one," and they weren't quite accurate. And but they weren't too far off because the old 666 was very, very badly damaged. Almost everybody was hit and wounded. They didn't have any landing gear, so even if they found a base, they knew that they couldn't get back to Port Moresby, where they had taken off from. So they had to A, find some place to land, and B, survive the landing. And I don't know how much more we want to give away, but that's the rest of the story. Did they make it back, and how, and who survived?
Well, I will tell you one story. Jay did finally see Johnny Abel, who always wanted to fly with the bullets in both his legs. The co-pilot is in the back. He's patching up everybody. And Johnny Abel says, Jay, what can I do? Jay says, take the wheel. Johnny says, I've never flown a plane before. He says, I'm going to tell you what to do, because Jay is wafting in and out of consciousness. He's in that liminal state. He's not sure. He's actually hallucinating. And he sees
he would end up losing half the blood in his body.
Yeah, he sees his mother's face appear. So Johnny Abel took them all the way back until they saw Point Oro. It was an American PT base, and that's when Jay kind of shook himself in, but he just didn't have it in him. It was just the life was seeping out of him.
Right.
And the co-pilot jumped back in the seat, and the co-pilot, the airstrip at Port Moresby they didn't have flaps, they didn't have anything, and the co-pilot said, I don't know if we're going to make this or not, but I'm taking her in. And he took her in, and well, we as we said at the very top, it was the only flight in the history of either the U.S. Army Air Force or the Air Force where two crew members were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And if you want to find out, one was awarded posthumously. And if you want to find out who lived and who died, well, you got to read the damn book.
Lucky 666.
Gentlemen, yeah, that's an absolutely incredible story. I have to tell you that we're not obviously going to finish the book, but we've only covered like 40% of this book, and there's even more at the end. When you get to the end about what happens afterwards, it is equally gut-wrenching, and it will just move you, inspire you, chill you. Gentlemen, I absolutely enjoyed every moment I spent on my back porch reading this book. Bob Drury, Tom Clavin, thank you very much for this. I do want to ask you one, just real quick, if you could tell us about your Halsey. Is it Halsey's Typhoon? That's the next book I'm going to be checking out.
Well, you know what? Go to our Amazon. Go to my Amazon page or Tom's Amazon page. It's like kids. You can't say what's your favorite. I mean, it's like the crew members are all Lucky 666. I mean, one day it's Halsey's Typhoon, which is about Admiral Halsey and his hubris sailing the entire Pacific Fleet into the worst typhoon of the 20th century. But I have a soft spot for Last Stand of Fox Company, which is that marine company that held that hill south of the Chosin Reservoir and allowed the road to remain open so the entire 1st Marine Division could get out somewhat safely. And I have a soft spot for the last book, our last book, Ray. The Heart of Everything That Is. It's about the only Indian, Red Cloud, a Sioux warrior headman, the only American Indian to ever defeat the United States in a war, not a battle, a war. Wow. We went to Red Cloud, hat in hand. Please sign the treaty. You win. And so, actually, that book spent, 26 weeks on the New York Times list? So if Lucky 666 spends half that time, I'll be happy.
Yeah, we will.
So Lucky 666, the Impossible Mission comes out October 25th. I've seen it on Amazon, obviously Kindle. It's going to be Audible as well. I'm a big Audible audiobook person because I drive a lot to and from work. So, gentlemen, if there's anything you want to add, please do. But I just want you to know this was a hell of a story, and you wrote it well, and you throw in so much stuff. I really do have appreciation of how nervous everyone in Australia and everyone in that area had to be, knowing that the Japanese were just so many miles north of them trying to come their way.
I'll say one thing, Ray. I don't know. You might want to edit this out. I know we're going long, but I was talking to a friend of mine. Believe it or not, I happened to be in a bar yesterday. I can't believe an Irishman was in a bar. And we were talking about whether it was the sailors of Halsey or the Marines up on Fox Hill in North Korea or the Marine security guards of Last Men Out who were stranded on the roof of the Saigon Embassy in '75. Or even the young American Indians and the cavalrymen who were fighting them. Tom and I like to write stories of ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that strikes me as a war movie lover, that whether you're from the John Wayne era or from the Tom Hanks era, most of these movies, the soldiers are in their 30s, their 40s, even Wayne in his 50s for the Green Berets. Hell, if you want to count Clint Eastwood, we're talking 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. But in reality, what strikes me is the youth of our fighting men and women. And as you know from my resume, I was a war correspondent for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And the men and women overseas who protect this country, their youth just blows me away. I mean, let's face it. You tell a 40-year-old, listen, you're going on a 1,200-mile suicide mission. He's going to tell you, screw you. But 19-year-old, I mean, Jay Zeamer at 26 years old was the old man. 19-year-old Johnny Abel, sure, I'll do it. Where do we go? And these youngsters, and they're kids to me, these kids that keep us safe, well, as soon as I get off with you, I'm raising a glass to them.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, just thank you very much. It was great. I look forward to going through your catalog. And I don't know what system y'all use to work this out, but the writing was excellent. And again, we covered very little of this book. You did a very good job of giving it a lot of context, and that makes it an excellent history book in my mind.
Thank you, Ray. I appreciate your
Thank you very much. Enjoyed this.
Thank you.